Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight, we now have the second emergency broadcast of 2017. Lots of stuff going on. We're going to try to talk about it in chronological order and put it in perspective, but needless to say, we are in a very dangerous situation, not just for the United States, not just for Syria, but for the rest of the world. The show tonight is being recorded on April 9th, not April 10th, as you're listening to it. So things, again, bear in mind, can change as we move on through time. But, again, it's very, very dangerous right now. I guess I'll go ahead and plug the show and the websites first, get that out of the way. If you're just joining us for the first time, you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. UCY.TV, UCY.TV/TT for Truth on the Tracks. All the archives are there, the YouTube videos, etc. Now, you can follow my work, activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, eraofwisdom.org, and, of course, brandonturbeville.com. And that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the books are there. All of the relevant information can be found at brandonturbeville.com, including the articles that I've just put up regarding these situations that we'll be talking about in the archives of this show are there as well. Now, what can we say? The world now is on the brink of World War III, and I think we can trace back some of these, I guess, the latest destabilizations of the world back to the St. Petersburg bombing. That's where we're going to start. We didn't get to talk about that much last time. We're going to talk about the bombing, and then I want to go into the U.S. bombing of Syria via the chemical weapons, and then the bombing itself, and talk about where we are, because in the span of about 48 to 72 hours, the world has gone from an alignment of forces that we generally knew what they were going to do. I say knew what they were going to do. We knew the way in which they were positioned. We knew their stated positions, and it looked like for about 24 to 48 hours that the United States was going to actually back off of Syria. We had UN Ambassador Nikki Haley saying that the United States was no longer interested in ensuring that Assad steps down. They were interested in defeating ISIS. That's not the greatest position in the world, but it's much better than what we had, where they were focused on Assad. Then 48 hours later, they're dropping bombs in Syria on the Syrian government. So we'll talk about how we got to where we're at. Now, we've got boats, Russian boats in the Mediterranean. We've got American boats heading to North Korea. We've got air defense systems now in Syria being beefed up. The Russian military is not deconflicting with the U.S. military. Battle in the United Nations with Bolivia, the United States, Russia, etc., Iran, and statements coming from the United States that they might not be through. And, of course, we have a U.S. incursion into Syria, in southern Syria on the Jordanian border. So we're going to try to get into all of that. But I want to start with the St. Petersburg bombing. The day after the St. Petersburg attacks, we had the world showing their hand, right? The result of the callous and stern responses coming from the West, right? The public responses were nothing like France or Belgium or any of these other nations. We didn't have a bunch of people holding up signs saying, "I stand with Russia." Nobody was changing their profile pictures to Russian flags. Apparently only when a Western nation or Israel is attacked by terrorists, then is it acceptable to stand in solidarity with them. There was some initial confusion. What we understand now is that there was anywhere from 10 to 14 people killed, at least 37 injured, after an explosion took place in a train carriage in a metro tunnel in St. Petersburg. It was reported that the explosion was set off by an explosive device hidden in a bag or a briefcase that was left on the train before it departed Sinaya Ploshad station, headed toward the Technologiski Institute station. There was apparently a secondary device that was disguised as a fire extinguisher, which didn't detonate, but was much larger than the first. The driver of the train has been hailed as a hero because of his decision to force the train into the next station. Had he remained stationary, the train would have been stuck in between tunnels, and it would have been a nightmare for rescue personnel to get there. But let's talk about the cause and the motive. We have Russian President Vladimir Putin stating the day after, "The causes of this event have not been determined yet, so it's too early to talk about possible causes. The investigation will show. Certainly we will consider all possibilities, common, criminal, but first of all of a terrorist nature." Then we have Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying, "It is unacceptable to seek some connection with the origin of the person, his religious beliefs. Terrorism is a crime against all mankind and against all religions. As for the media quoted by you that the terrorist act is revenge for our policy in Syria, it's cynical, mean." Now, according to CBS News correspondent Elizabeth Palmer, the chief bombing suspect was Akbarzon Jalilov, and he was identified by Kyrgyzstan security forces. Jalilov was born in Kyrgyzstan 1995. Russian authorities later confirmed that he was indeed the prime suspect, and the National Russian Investigative Committee also confirmed that they were still searching for Jalilov's suspected accomplices. The investigation is still ongoing, I believe, determining his motive, whether or not he was connected to ISIS. Supporters of the terrorist organization did praise the attack, but it was yet to take credit for it. In the last issue of Dabik, one of ISIS's media mouthpieces, the organization did threaten to carry out more attacks in Russia as payback for Russian attacks on ISIS in Syria. Western media mostly suggested that the attack was a reprisal by ISIS for Russia's involvement in Syria, and that's an interesting proposition, isn't it? Since the same media constantly suggests that Russia's presence in Syria is not doing any good to defeat ISIS. So the question would be, why would ISIS target Russia for not defeating it in Syria? You know, aside from the faulty logic there, we have the mainstream press saying these things. They might be actually onto something. The fact that a terrorist attack would occur in Russia, considering all of the events surrounding and preceding the bombing, just not a message from bearded freaks, but from the CIA, the Mossad, and MI6. It's well known that Russian presence in Syria is confounding the imperialist agenda of NATO, and that Russia across much of the world is preventing many of the Western aggressive acts from taking hold. It's possible that the attack could have been organic. It may have been Chechen terrorism, which, you know, we have to look at the West when it comes to that as well. It's largely manipulated and controlled by the West also. It may be a message to Russia and Putin in particular. This attack may be a warning to Putin to back off his support of Assad in Syria and the Donbass separatists, as well as its opposition to the Western agenda elsewhere in the world. The context in which this bombing took place can't be overlooked. Not just facing the crisis in Syria, in Donbass, in Asia, the growing NATO expansion, we've also seen Russia dealing with Western destabilization tactics which were unleashed domestically. Only a matter of a few weeks ago, the usual suspects were added again in Russia. We have waves of protests led by agents backed by the United States and the Western NGO industrial complex. The protests were directed at corruption, and that's a legitimate issue, but it's also one of the favorites of the color revolution apparatus, because if you have success, you overthrow the government, and your success, you were aiming at corruption. It doesn't really produce real results because you don't have anything to measure it by. You don't have any real demands. You're saying, stop being bad. You get new administrators, and the new administrators are also bad. But you have these very colorful, shadowy ways of judging it. So it constantly changes, and it's harder it's easier to hide, actually. Now, 99 of these marches took place at the same time all across Russia. It was a coordinated attempt to destabilize the Russian government. The head of the protest was the notorious Western-supported Alexei Navalny, who's actually been on the payroll of the National Endowment for Democracy. The protest accomplished little. It just gave the Russian government the authority to arrest Navalny. And that's what they did. Now, on Monday, April 3rd, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a Western-backed terrorist group operating inside Syria, launched a series of mortars at the Russian embassy in Damascus, which resides in the Mazara district. Ultimately, they missed the target. They were at least able to come close, though. And then, the same day, April 3rd, there was the attack in St. Petersburg. And here's something else that's notable. Putin himself was in St. Petersburg at the time of the bombing. And another interesting factoid is that St. Petersburg is actually Putin's hometown. So you have to wonder if this is a message to Putin personally. Was it a warning that not only showed him how close he is to danger in reality, physically, if the international deep state of the West and Russia also decides to strike at him, and perhaps it was a message in that it was his hometown, right? It was an attempt to strike at something close and dear to him, like his home city. Now the message. This attack could be seen as an attack on the will and resolve of the Russian people. In other words, the message is that if Russia continues to be involved in Syria, they can expect more terrorist attacks in Russia. And a military operation in Syria being in full swing. It was undertaken with the support of the majority of Russians. An attempt might be underway to convince Russians to stop supporting the operation. In fact, break their spirit with the threat of perpetual terror. Now, the response from the Western media, from the United States, and from Europe, it's worth noting that despite the fact that Europe and the United States and the entire Google, Facebook community always erupts with solidarity and empty slogans whenever a European or Israeli city is attacked, there were no major statements of solidarity with Russia. There was a statement from the Trump administration of support for Russia and the Russian people against terrorism, but beyond that, it was virtually non-existent. The Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, only a week before, flew the UK flag, or the colors of the UK flag on the gate. In the past, it's flown the French flag, it's flown the Israeli flag, but it refused to do so for Russia. It claimed that St. Petersburg is not a sister city, and that's why they decided to do it, but neither is Jerusalem, or neither is Orlando, but that didn't preclude the flying of the flag for those cities. So the entire Western response to the Russian attacks has been incredibly cold, and that's not by accident. Now, at the end of the day, it's impossible with the knowledge that we have right now to definitively prove that the attack in St. Petersburg was orchestrated by Western intelligence. But if ISIS played a role in the attack, the blame does fall at the feet of the West, since it's the United States, NATO, the GCC, Israel, that created the organization to begin with. And it's the same powers that fund it and direct it today. So regardless of who was responsible for the attack, it was undoubtedly a clear message to Russia. And if it was ISIS, then we have to lay the blame at the feet of the United States, of NATO, the GCC, and Israel. So what happens after that? Well, we have the chemical attack. Now, it seems as if it's just on cue. The Western corporate press was on fire with stories about Assad's brutality, chemical weapons attacks against civilians. Obviously, the United States and NATO and their media mouthpieces were united in condemnation of the Assad government and the Syrian military, despite there being no evidence that it committed the attacks. Indeed, we have all the Western powers blaming Assad. They can do that all they want, but the available credible evidence suggests that the deployment of chemical weapons this time around, like all the other times before it, was indeed the work of terrorists and their supporters. Of course, the evidence doesn't matter to propagandists, and despite the public appearance that the United States is in disarray, that the U.S. president is battling the deep state apparatus, it seems now that the deep state and the president are finally reading from the same page. Now let's talk about the incident. We had a bunch of reports. The incident occurred on April 4th, 2017, here in Idlib, Syria, the village of Khan Sheikhoun. Has been reported that chemical weapons were used or detonated, resulting in the death of at least 58 people, including 11 children. And that's all we know for sure about the incident. We don't know it was an attack. We don't know if it was an accident. We only know that whatever happened has been turned into an international incident that was aimed at demonizing the Assad government and testing Russia and Syria. So, for its part, the Syrian government has categorically denied launching chemical weapons against civilians or terrorists in Idlib. Russia reaffirmed that the Syrian military is innocent of the charges. A military source told Al-Masdar that the army, quote, has not and does not use them, not in the past and not in the future, because it does not have them in the first place. But if you listen to the Western corporate press, you'd be excused in believing that there was overwhelming, damning evidence to the contrary, because both the press and Western governments continue to hurl accusations at the Syrian government. Some outlets have even gone so far to blame Russia for dropping these chemical missiles into Idlib, an impossibility since Russia was not conducting any airstrikes over Idlib at the time. So let's talk about some of the ideas of what might be going on here. The weapons depot. Right, the Russian Defense Ministry. The incident says the incident was not a chemical weapons attack, but it was the result of a Syrian military airstrike against a terrorist weapons depot that was also being used for the production of chemical weapons. We have Major General Igor Konashenkov, the Defense Ministry spokesman. He stated that the facility was being used to produce these chemical weapons for shipment to terrorist forces inside Iraq. And the warehouse that was bombed, according to him, was being used to both produce and store shells that contain toxic gas, which were shipped to Iraq and used there. He pointed out that the Iraqi government and a number of international organizations have confirmed the use of these types of weapons by terrorists operating in Iraq. Now, he added that the terrorists used the same type of weapons in Aleppo, where Russian military experts took samples in 2016. The Defense Ministry claims to have confirmed this information as being fully objectified and verified. They also claim that the victims of Khan Sheikhoun exhibited identical symptoms to those shown by victims in the Aleppo attacks. This is Major General Igor Konashenkov saying, quote, according to Russian airspace monitoring systems, yesterday between 11:30 and 12:30 local time, the Syrian aviation carried out an airstrike on the eastern outskirts of Khan Sheikhoun, targeting a major ammunition storage facility of terrorists and a cluster of military hardware. The territory of this storage facility housed workshops to produce projectiles stuffed with toxic agents. From this major arsenal, chemical-laden weapons were delivered by militants to Iraq. Their use by terrorists was confirmed on numerous occasions by international organizations and official authorities of the country. End quote. So, video footage from the social network shows the people affected in Khan Sheikhoun had the same symptoms of poisoning as the victims of the Aleppo attack last year. Konashenkov says, we assure that this information is completely unbiased and true. The terrorists, of course, disagree. Hassan Haj Ali, commander of the Free Idlib Army rebel group, rejected it. He said everyone saw the plane while it was bombing with gas. Likewise, all the civilians in the area know that there are no military positions there or places for the manufacture of weapons. The various factions of the opposition are not capable of producing these substances. Well, at first they said it was helicopters. Now it's planes. But and as to the capability of terrorists to produce these weapons, that's false. It is absolutely false. Khan Sheikhoun is terrorist-held territory, and it is held by force. Naturally, the Syrian people in Khan Sheikhoun are no more interested in being ruled by these Neanderthal bearded freaks, these monkeys, as any other town in the country. And the terrorists must have to be present then in order to maintain order. and prevent Syrians from expressing civilized behavior, which is something that these subhuman freaks are unaccustomed to, civilization and humanity. Now, the terrorists in Syria have for years had the ability to manufacture, produce, and use chemical weapons. Back in 2012, in December 2012, after the terrorists managed to capture a chlorine factory inside Syria, the Syrian government actually issued a warning that the terrorists might attempt to use chemical weapons of that nature to overthrow and oppress the government and people of Syria, respectively. The Syrian Foreign Ministry stated at the time, terrorist groups may resort to using chemical weapons against the Syrian people after having gained control of a toxic chlorine factory. Again, the chemical attacks in Ghouta were initially blamed on Assad and the Syrian government, but they were later found out to be the work of the Western-backed terrorists who'd gone so far as to capture civilians in Latakia and use them as human stage props for video footage and propaganda purposes. Now, in August of 2012, it was reported that the terrorists had managed to capture a missile site belonging to the Syrian army, which contained chemical weapons. The terrorists erroneously claimed that the reason for attacking the site was to prevent the Assad government from using the weapons against members of the opposition. But you don't have to speculate very much as the possibilities available here. In June 2012, the death squads gained access to chemical weapons. In August, they gained access to a delivery mechanism in the form of missiles. Now, it's a coincidence that should really cause you to examine another event which occurred shortly before the assault on the missile site. In July of 2012, there were reports of so-called Free Syrian Army militants seen trying on gas masks, along with reports of Libyan chemical weapon caches and equipment being discovered in Damascus. And together with the acquisition of the missile delivery capability, by virtue of taking over that Syrian missile site and the possession of the chemical weapons themselves via Libya, the acquisition of gas masks points to preparation for the launch of an actual chemical attack, or at least the possibility of it on the part of the terrorists. And then we have a statement made by one of the terrorists to Reuters in April 2012. The rebels are getting better at bomb making. As you know, desperation is the mother of invention. Reuters said that the terrorists were able to develop more sophisticated bombs because of rare outside donations, although Reuters didn't attempt to name the mysterious sources, as they hardly ever do. And then back to August 2012. We have a false flag plot being discovered, which was hatched between NATO and Saudi Arabia, and that would have staged a chemical attack, chemical weapons deployment in Syria, either by mercenary firms or by the terrorists themselves, that would have subsequently been blamed on the Assad government and served as a pretext for NATO intervention and the creation of a buffer zone in the country. The source reported the impending attack, stated to Syrian news channel Adunia that a Saudi Arabian firm had fitted 1,400 ambulance vehicles with anti-gas and anti-chemical filtering systems at a cost of $97,000 each in preparation for a chemical weapons attack carried out by terrorists, the FSA, using mortar rounds. And then a further 400 vehicles were prepared as troop carriers. So the attack was set to make use of white phosphorus, sarin, and mustard gas. It then stands as another questionable coincidence that among the weapons possessed by the Libyan regime and now in the hands of death squads was large quantities of bulk mustard agent as well as sarin. Now, the potential false flag that I just mentioned, which was reported by Adunia, was set to be launched on densely populated areas, most likely Dara, which is a city on the Syrian-Jordan border. After these newly fitted ambulances would pour into Syria under the guise of humanitarian aid, they would be painted with the labels Syrian People's Relief, and the ambulances would actually be basically armored personnel carriers that were going to be capitalizing on this manufactured disaster for the ability to deploy personnel, create a buffer zone. Furthermore, we had the same company that manufactured and fitted those ambulances to be used in the attack being based in Riyadh. It was negotiating a contract with the Yemeni government. for the manufacture of military vehicles for the Yemeni army. I don't want to get too far off topic here. December 2012, a video was obtained by the Syria Tribune and subsequently released in their report and posted on YouTube, which allegedly shows that NATO-backed terrorists testing chemical weapons on lab rabbits. This is what the Syrian Tribune describes the video, how they do it. The video, seen here, starts with several scenes showing chemical containers with Tekim labels. Tekim is a Turkish chemical company, and some lab equipment, while playing jihadist chants in the background. A glass box then appears with two rabbits inside, with a poster on the wall behind it reading "The Almighty Wind Brigade, Katibat al-Ri al-Sasar." A person wearing a lab mask then mixes chemicals in a beaker in the glass box, and we see some gas emitting from the beaker. About a minute later, the rabbits start to have random convulsions and then die. The person says, "You saw what happened? This will be your fate, you infidel Alawites. I swear by Allah to make you die like these rabbits, 1 minute only after you inhale the gas." So, the Syrian Tribune comments that judging from the reaction of the rabbits, the gas had to be a nerve agent. The number of containers, if it wasn't a bluff, indicated the ability to produce a considerable amount of the gas. It could have been done by means of a smoke generator placed in the target area, an explosion, a suicide bomb, a chemmed car, simply by using a humidifier they could do it. And then in March 2013, we had another YouTube video released which contained the clip of a second test of weapons on captive rabbits by the death squads. That video also contained an audio recording of a phone conversation between two Free Syria Army fighters discussing the quote, details of a plan to carry out chemical weapons attack capable of impacting an area the size of 1 kilometer. Quote, the recording of the phone conversation is supposed to be between two FSA terrorists, one located in Syria and the other outside. The terrorist inside the Syria, Abu Hassan, asked the one on the other end of the line to send a message to Sheikh Suleiman, a then terrorist-held military base in Aleppo, and he says he asked for 2 chemical bombs, phosphoric, so that they could finish this whole thing. I want them to be effective, he said. The radius of the strike or reach of the gases has to be 1 kilometer. That video also has a clip of the terrorists openly announcing their plans to engage in chemical weapons attacks, all while surrounded by the bottles of nitric acid and other substances. Now, here's the question. Was it sarin or something else? We have Brad Blankenship of Al-Masdar. He's not speaking for Al-Masdar. He's a writer and a journalist. He writes for Al-Masdar. But this is what he says, quote, first, it was not sarin gas that was used, but most likely chlorine gas. Victims reported a smell from the exposure to whatever chemical was used, while sarin gas is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. The Syrian opposition has had access to the means to produce chlorine gas for some time. They use these weapons frequently and is cheap to produce, easy to use, and they receive a steady supply of chlorine agents from the Saudis, which have at times been seized by the Syrian Arab Army, particularly in Aleppo, where photographs have been released. End quote. Now, as he points out, the terrorists have had the ability to produce, manufacture, and deploy chlorine as well as other chemical weapons since early on in the conflict. I've just went through a number of these incidents as proof. Now, why would the Syrian government use chemical weapons, and why would they do it at Khan Sheikhoun? Considering the hysteria over chemical weapons and the constant attempt by Western governments to use chemical weapons as an excuse to invade Syria, why on earth would the Syrian government use them, even if the government did indeed retain the weapons? That would be absolutely foolish in terms of world public opinion, in terms of opinion of the United Nations, in terms of provoking the United States. And on top of that, Khan Sheikhoun is not even a militarily significant target. So why would the Syrian government use chemical weapons at this location and not somewhere more important? Again, I quote Brad Blankenship. It is unlikely that such an attack was carried out deliberately by the Syrian armed forces. The Syrian Arab Army is decisively winning the war at this point in the conflict on essentially every front. A resort to weapons of mass destruction would not only be militarily irrational, considering Khan Sheikhoun is nowhere near the front line, but would be politically absurd considering the new U.S. administration's statement last week that the Assad government would no longer be the primary target in Syria. It is important to be skeptical of the idea that a government at war that relies on broad cross-sectional support from its own people to maintain its sovereignty is willing to attack its own civilians. Indeed, I agree. And of course, we know that Syria does not have those chemical weapons. We know that they're no longer there. And who would I cite but the United Nations itself, the OPCW? You can actually go see the reports, the tweets, whatever. OPCW, they confirm that that they're simply not there, that the last were taken out. Now, the question here is, did the chemical weapons get released at all? You got to go a bit further down the rabbit hole for this one, but it might be a very real possibility that the chemical weapons attack did not take place at all, even as an unknowing side effect to a Syrian airstrike against terrorist weapons depot. Only a day after the incident took place, there's a litany of holes in the official story posed by Western governments, terrorists, and corporate Western press. Let's look at the sources. One of the red flags regarding the official story of this incident is the fact that the sole source of the reports come from the opposition, meaning the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the White Helmets, terrorists themselves. The Syrian Observatory for the Human Rights is a notorious pro-terrorist organization run by one guy out of England, Abdul Rahman, and funded by some nameless EU country. So it's at best only connected to Syria through its connections to terrorists and Western intelligence agencies. The White Helmets, we've been through them extensively in my articles on this show, even more so by Vanessa Beeley of 21st Century Wire and The Wall Will Fall. You can read for days about the treachery of the White Helmets listed in the articles that I've got in my own article about it. I'll give you some titles in a minute. But to suffice it to say that the White Helmets are nothing more than a terrorist support group, as well as an ever-ready Hollywood propaganda video team. The group has been known to stage a number of atrocities allegedly committed by the Assad regime, just to be revealed later as frauds. But the White Helmet supporters even demonstrated how easy it is to fake tragic scenes like that when, during a street demonstration in Europe, the demonstrators painted themselves to look like victims of the evil Bashar al-Assad. And any evidence produced by this group is completely untrustworthy. It should be regarded as propaganda. And it should also be noted this very group that produced the first videos of the incident, which were disseminated throughout the Western media as fact, the propaganda group. This is where the first videos came from. So if you're interested in the White Helmets, then go read White Helmets Show Solidarity with Al-Qaeda, Hold Citizens Hostage in Damascus with No Water. Read Medical Doctors Question Veracity of Footage in White Helmets Documentary, Al-Qaeda Wins Documentary. And then, of course, White Helmets NGO. I'm sorry, I think I gave you the wrong title of that second article. I think it is Medical Doctors Question Veracity of Footage in White Helmets Documentary, Al-Qaeda Wins Oscar. And then we have White Helmets NGO, a rescue and assist operation under guise of human rights. And then Vanessa Beeley's White Helmets, War by Way of Deception. That's a series. And then Beeley's Exposed Syria's White Helmets are Al-Qaeda's Civil Defense. Now, in the video that you can see of these these chemical weapons attacks, it does appear that whether or not the incident was staged, children were actually killed. So if it is a staged incident, it's even more gruesome on the part of any of the groups that may have staged it. We see several children in the videos that do appear to be suffocating from some type of chemical substance. Others have unexplained head injuries. It's known 250 people, of course, were kidnapped by Al-Qaeda the week before from Hama, which is a city nearby. And interestingly enough, that is the same number as the current body count of the wounded and killed civilians there in the chemical weapons attack. Isn't that in Khan Sheikhoun? Isn't that interesting? We've seen this before. Now, what about the terrorist doctor? There's a rock star of this incident. It's Shahjul Islam. He's a Pakistani British doctor who's being used as a source for many of the reports that are used by Western media, and he's being represented as a selfless hero saving innocent lives during this whole event. But for a doctor in the middle of one of the biggest gas attacks and atrocities of the war, he's quite active on social media, on Twitter, and the media in general. In fact, you only need to go to his Twitter page to see that he's tweeting info in real time that patients and victims are pouring into the hospital. Shouldn't he be treating them? He's tweeting about them. In fact, at one point, he actually puts out an offer to video chat with anybody who wanted to interview him. This is from a doctor who allegedly is tending to hordes of emergency chemical weapons victims. It's hardly believable. But there's more to him than meets the eye. In fact, he faced terror charges in England for kidnapping and torturing 2 British journalists in Syria. He was even struck off, there was a case where he was struck off the British medical register. I think that case was dismissed, but regardless, he was investigated for kidnapping and torturing 2 British journalists in Syria. Is this your moderate rebel? He seems like a savage to me. Dutch media have taken to describing him as a rebel. Not a doctor, but a rebel. So I guess that's his allegiance to Al-Qaeda. That's not an organization known for its love of innocent civilians. And of course, we should mention that PRISM the Gift Fund, that's a UK organization that sent medical equipment to Islam. They're actually being criticized slightly because it provided him with the material, which actually goes to terrorists and terrorist brigades, but it was supposed to be going to refugees. Now, let's look at these convenient circumstances. It's worth noting that the white helmets who were operating in the same area as the incident were provided with sarin protective respirators and hazmat suits. Photos exist that show these terrorists trying on the suits 1 month ago in the same location as the attack that took place in Khan Sheikhoun. Despite the nature of a sarin attack, because contact with skin can cause the same symptoms as inhaling it, we see the photos of these heroic white helmets handling the victims who had apparently just been gassed without their suits, without their respirators, and without gloves on their hands. Again, we know that the OPCW confirmed that Syria does not have chemical weapons. It completely dismantled the stockpiles in 2013. The rebels have not gotten rid of their chemical weapons. Remember Seymour Hersh had intelligence reports showing the terrorists smuggled in chemical weapons from Libya through Turkey with the approval of Hillary Clinton. This disgusting witch, after 20 years, nearly 30 years of being hated by America, can you please just go away, you reptilian fraud? Stop torturing us with your cackling, with your idiocy, with your arrogance. This woman has to go. She should be in prison for many different things. We can start back to the 70s and work our ways up if we have to, but just get her out of here. Of course, she's sitting in her Mao suit next to interviewers complaining about Trump, not that he bombed Syria, but that he isn't bombing them enough. She says, I would have taken out their airfields. Well, you would have done a lot of things, you bloodthirsty bitch, but please keep your mouth shut. We have no interest in what Hillary Clinton would have done. We all know that she's a bloodthirsty warmonger. We all know about that. But the problem is the Clintonistas, the idiot leftists who follow this short Mao Zedong Pied Piper all the way out of town. Right? They follow her every move as if she's some kind of voice of reason. This woman is a psychopath. She's not mentally capable of serving in any capacity. She's criminally insane and should be treated as such. And of course, I don't want to get too far off the topic, but what about Bernie Sanders? Bernie the bomber. Bernie is now saying that we should have no-fly zones. He's also doing the same thing. Trump made a mistake in Syria. He should have done more. How do you like that, Bernie supporters? This twit has, if he showed you clearly that he didn't have any balls whatsoever in the campaign, now he's showing you that even if you had gotten him elected, Even if you had defeated the cackling witch and you had gotten Bernie the bomber into office, he would have done the same thing. Even Bernie. Don't you feel a bit let down? Time to drop this old fart. He's not worth anything. Leave him alone. If you've got to find a standard bearer, find somebody else. Leave this guy alone. He's worthless. He needs to go. He's got to go too. He gives you good talks about free education and free health care. He never tells you how he's going to pay for it. I can, by the way, go to BrandonTurbeville.com, but he won't. So let Bernie the bomber go by the wayside. He's finished anyway, and even if he wasn't, he doesn't have any guts whatsoever. So let him fade into history where he belongs. Now, back to the terrorists in Syria, as opposed to those here. In 2013, again, the terrorists showed themselves with videos killing rabbits with chemical weapons. And again, sarin, it can be absorbed through the skin. Why aren't these guys using the proper material? Sarin is considered a WMD, apparently. I'm not sure I would consider it a WMD, but that's what they tend to report in the news, right? So if it was indeed used, then it must have been in a relatively weak, non-weaponized form. Of course, that's not what you hear in the media. Now, we also have the Gulf-based Orient TV ran a story where it said that tomorrow we are launching a media campaign to cover the airstrikes on Hama countryside, including the usage of chemical warfare against civilians. Now, what is that but demonstration of foreknowledge? The attack, of course, came right after the United States said that it's no longer focused on forcing Assad to step down. And then within days we have tricky Nikki Haley, or Nikki the Nazi, and Rex Tillerson, I guess we should say, beginning to walk back on that statement. And only a few days after that, we have Steve Bannon being removed from the National Security Council. Perhaps this is why. Perhaps Zionist Steve Bannon was actually the voice of reason in this instance. So we have the attacks at Khan Sheikhoun, and then we had Trump getting out in front of reporters and being his usual articulate self, saying that Assad has crossed many, many lines. He said he planned to deal with Syria. When he was asked how he would respond, he said, "You'll see," which that's usually a hint. His vocabulary is somewhat limited, so you get an idea. Again, the OPCW confirmed that Syria gave up its weapons. They were all gone in June of 2014. They were shipped out of the country, according to the OPCW. It says the ship has just left the port. That was Ahmet Zumku, said that in The Hague. He was the head of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Now, what else do we have here? Then we get the attacks. The United States doing what it does. I guess the empire's going to empire, right? The Donald Trump administration launches Tomahawk missiles against the Al-Shawarat base in Syria, right? He says that these chemical weapons attack killed beautiful babies in Syria, and he blamed the Syrian government, said it changed his opinion on Assad. They ordered Tomahawk missiles fired against the Syrian military base under the guise of protecting civilians. The Al-Shayarat airfield, Syrian military site close to Homs, was targeted by 60 U.S. Tomahawk missiles. This is a tragedy. I'm not going to go through Trump's words. Clearly they were written for him. I don't know what to say other than I believe the United States may have crossed the Rubicon. This is a travesty. This is an absolute travesty. Nikki Haley, of course, Tricky Nikki, saying that when the United Nations consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times in the life of states that we are compelled to take our own action. Well, isn't that interesting? Unilateral war. This is Trump, and I will tell you it's already happened that my attitude towards Syria and Assad has changed very much across many, many lines. This is typical of Trump, right? This is the world is at his ego. Everything is up to his opinion. If he has an opinion of something, that is the way the world should go. But let's take a look. I'd like to read a few wise words that were tweeted back in 2013. We should stay the hell out of Syria. The rebels are just as bad as the current regime. What will we get for our lives and $1 billion? Zero. How about, no, Dopey, I would not go into Syria, but if I did, it would be by surprise and not blurted all over the media like fools. All right? But the operative part of it is I would not go into Syria. What will we get for bombing Syria besides more debt and a possible long-term conflict? Obama needs congressional approval. All right. President Obama's weakness and indecision may have saved us from doing a horrible and very costly in more ways than money attack on Syria. If the U.S. attacks Syria and hits the wrong targets, killing civilians, there will be worldwide hell to pay. Stay away and fix broken U.S. What I'm saying is stay out of Syria. The only reason President Obama wants to attack Syria is to save face over his very dumb red line statement. Do not attack Syria, fix USA. Again, to our very foolish leader, do not attack Syria. If you do, many very bad things will happen, and from that fight the U.S. gets nothing. President Obama, do not attack Syria. There is no upside and tremendous downside. Save your powder for another and more important day. Don't attack Syria, an attack that will bring nothing but trouble for U.S. Focus on making our country strong and great again. Donald J. Trump in 2013 as a result of the chemical attacks in Ghouta. It's a shame President Trump didn't consult candidate Trump in that, isn't it? Now, we know that politicians lie, and then they get elected, and then they start wars. That is the American tradition. Everyone does it. We are aware of that. But what's funny is that, guess what, Trump? You've opened yourself up to impeachment. You took us to a military conflict based on a lie, just like the dumbass that you criticized for Iraq. And you've out-dumbassed the dumbass. Because you now have a tweet proving that you know that you need congressional approval. Congratulations, jackass. You did it to yourself, and you should be impeached for it. Now, what I will say is that the left doesn't seem to care at all that the Obama administration went to war for 8 years. And every time it did it, it destroyed Libya, it bombed Syria, and it didn't do it with the congressional approval. Why? Because the Congress gave their approval to launch war on with the war on terror to George W. Bush, and a giant blank check, which basically meant that the empire can now march across the world. And Obama took advantage of that constitutional lawyer that he is. Trump probably won't be able to get away with it as much as the Messiah. But nevertheless, he could start a war. A good quote from Kurt Nimmo. He says, I am flabbergasted nobody saw this coming. His election comments on stealing oil, torture, and killing families should have been a tip-off. Yeah, I agree with Kurt. So, lastly, what happened with the airstrikes? Well, the airstrikes at Al-Shuairat, what did they do? Let me read the quote, this inarticulate quote of Donald Trump. Assad choked out the lives of innocent men, women, and children. It was a slow and brutal death for so many. Even beautiful babies were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. No child of God should ever suffer such horror. Well, at least he didn't cry and weep like Barack Obama, but of course that's because Trump is the tough guy, right? This is now a dick-showing contest for Trump and many of his Republican supporters. Apparently, the children that Trump just murdered were not children of God, right? They must not have. Al-Shara Air Base, again near Homs, many of those missiles struck their targets, and that's a tragedy, the fact that it even struck them. But some of them were reportedly shot down, but some of those missiles went into the countryside and killed 9 civilians. 4 of them were children. So, since children were murdered by America's missiles, we can only assume now that they were not beautiful babies, right? Only beautiful babies if someone else kills them. They must not have been children at all, since no child of God should ever have to suffer such horror. I guess they will just be collateral damage, just numbers to Americans who've become the most bloodthirsty population now on the face of the earth, second only to the Israelis. We know these children are not going to be acknowledged, and the blood-drenched war hawks in the American Congress can claim that they took a stand for human rights. Business as usual, and the U.S. government. The baby killer in chief now is taking over right where the former baby killer in chief left off. And guess what? Guess what happened? Trump orders the airstrikes, which he knows are going to kill human beings. Valiant soldiers who are fighting terrorism. He knows it's going to kill them. And he knows that lives are going to be lost, possibly even civilians. And what does he do? He goes to dinner with the Chinese president as the bombs are dropping down on the victims. What does that say? To launch a missile attack and then go to dinner as the bombs are coming down. Let me read you Trump's words that he would be wise to listen to. Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also to end terrorism of all kinds and all types. We ask for God's wisdom as we face the challenge of our very troubled world. We pray for the lives of the wounded and for the souls of those who have passed. That's Trump's words. We all agree with that statement, Trump, but not all of us have blood on our hands. You have, in your own words, done a very bad thing, a very nasty thing, my friend, and you possibly have brought America across the Rubicon to a point that we might not be able to return. What should I say about the war protest movement? What war protest movement? What I saw, there were thousands of people, thousands across the country, vocalizing opposition to the war in Syria. This is a very dark time for America. Not dark necessarily because we're facing a fight in our government, but it's dark because so much of our own people are dark in their minds, in their hearts, in their spirits. They're just dark. They either don't know what's going on, or they don't care, or they're actually supporting it. The left and the right have united in support for war, not just in Congress, not between the two lovers, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, and Hillary Clinton and Dick Cheney, because you know when you got McCain and Graham and Clinton and Cheney and ISIS on the same side, you're really on the right side of history, right? Because they're all in support of this. The Democrats want war. The Republicans want war. The American people, the left, they want war. They're criticizing Trump for not going to war enough. The Republicans have never seen a war they didn't like. So what's happening? The very scant few anti-war protests that we saw this week or the other night, what just happened? Antifa, or Antifa, however you say it, attacks the so-called alt-right people who were there, and they're all there to protest the war. So you get an anti-war movement that barely exists, and what exists of that, they start fighting each other. Where are you people at? Or do we truly have no one in the country who's willing to stand up against this war? Because it's not always going to be over there. Eventually it will come here, and you'll get what you deserve. And the worst part of it will be that you know you deserve it, that you will deserve it, whether you know it or not, actually. And this is what a lack of empathy and understanding will get you. And the sad part of it is that a lot of good people in the country are going to pay for the stupidity of the majority and the callousness of the majority. And of course, not the listeners to this show. I'm not talking to you guys because you're all aware of it, or you wouldn't be listening to the show. But we are in a very dark time. If you are aware, if you do oppose this war, if you do oppose World War III, if you do want to see this country change for the better, then you better raise your voice now. This is threat level midnight, ladies and gentlemen. You've got to do something now. It's not going to be enough to sit back and let other people do it. It's going to take everybody. And even then, who knows? So, I want you all to go to BrandonTurbeville.com and check out the articles I put there if you're interested in the information. I want you all to be thinking about what you can do and to do it. We're continuously trying to put out solutions, political solutions, demands to be made. And, of course, this war right now is at the forefront of the world. And we need to be involved in trying to stop it. So, feel free to use all the materials at the website. Share it, send it out. I don't care what you do with it, so long as you get it out there. If it works, do what you can. Speak to the people in your own circle of influence. Do what you can to stop it. You can call Congress. You can protest. You can try to get other people on your side. You can do whatever you can. It's time to pull out all the stops. And hopefully we'll be back next week in order to discuss the situation further, and hopefully we have better news. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.